active listening is such an important skill here. I come from parents who are in the mental health field, and so I just picked up active listening as a very important thing, but that also is a key way to listen better, is to be active about it. So echoing and paraphrasing are just amazing tools.
Welcome, Model FAs. This is David DeCelle, president of the Model FA, and I have with me a very special guest, Ivan Farber. So before I go ahead and introduce Ivan, I want to share with you how we got introduced. So we've been working with a company for about a year or so now, and one of their advisors, Michael Van Sant, has a relationship with both of us, and he's the one who ultimately bridged this gap for us. So shout out to Michael, really grateful for this engagement that we're experiencing today and excited that you were able to bridge the gap and bring us together. So because of you, this is possible. So Michael, thank you. And Ivan, welcome. So Ivan, for the last 26 years, has worked in marketing, sales, training, and relationship management in the financial services industry. He has his bachelor's degree from Tufts University and MBA from Boston College, where I grew up in Massachusetts. Currently works as a relationship manager at a privately held financial services company. And he's also the author of a book called Conversations, How to Manage Your Business Relationships, one conversation at a time, and is also the host of a podcast called Conversations About Conversation. So if you are connected with me personally on any of the social platforms, you've seen a bunch of clips. Ivan and Jules were gracious enough to have me on their podcast a few weeks ago. So hopefully you've had a chance to tune into that. And if not, we'll make sure to make the link available on all of our social platforms. But Ivan, welcome.
Thank you so much for that great welcome.
Awesome. So you have almost as many years of experience as I've been on the earth. So I am very much looking forward to asking you a bunch of questions, getting your insight, and getting a sense as to, in your years of experience, what you found to be helpful as it relates to conversing with folks. So, on the episode I was on your podcast, I spoke more so maybe categorically about building relationships. And taking a look at your book, my understanding is you get much more granular in that actual process. So before we actually dive into the book, help us understand, where did this come from, right? What motivated you to get this in place, and where was the inspiration for that?
Much like your story, when you told me you got tired of sucking, I got tired of being inadequate in conversations. And through the benefit of a number of mentors, a lot of training programs, books, I just realized I had to bring a better game to what I see as the arena for management. I might have right now somewhere between 6 and 8 conversations a day. And so I came to the philosophy that there was no excuse for not bringing my A game to every conversation, and also found that really where relationships live is in conversations. And yet people do the things like send cupcakes to people or send thank you notes. But in terms of the arena, the court that you get on in a limited amount of your day, being fully prepared. So it came from, in my career, going through meltdowns and panics and bubbles and lots of mergers to get the discipline that I've created in my conversation model.
Awesome. So we have an assessment tool that we created, Ivan, called Advisor DNA. And we believe that advisors fall into 4 main categories in their business, which is a connector on the front end that probably doesn't need to read your book, right? Because that's what their natural inclination is. And certainly there's nuggets in the book that can be helpful. But my point of bringing that up is they just have that way about them to where they can talk to anyone about anything, right? And then we have the rainmakers that are really good at identifying the problem and presenting a compelling solution to get that prospect or client to take action on those suggestions. Then we have the guardian, which is the relationship manager that's really meant to bring these folks from a new client to a raving fan to the point to where they want to refer. And then the architects who are building the financial plans. So in our model, we find that there's certain folks where relationship building and holding conversations just comes naturally. But what you're alluding to is this did not come naturally for you. So what you're saying is that there's some hope for those who need some help in that department.
There's absolutely hope. But what I want to add is that the people who are natural, they don't know necessarily what they're doing. And I find that they're extroverted. They tend to relax. They don't prepare enough. And so they wind up going down roads that are not good roads to go down. And so the book is also for them. It's for the extrovert who could use some discipline. But yes, the real help to people is the introvert who just could really use some structure around what they're doing.
Well, I'm glad that you brought that up. I think back to, and I won't share them on this podcast, but early on in my career, when I was in my early 20s, being my extroverted self, I've certainly had conversations go in directions that maybe weren't as appropriate for a professional setting. So when you put it like that, a little structure would have been helpful in my early career.
So halfway through my career, I thought I was really good. I had been a professional speaker, a professional coach. I'd brought in hundreds of millions of dollars as a wholesaler, marketing, sales. And then I had a mentor who I affectionately referred to as my tour mentor. And he didn't really torment me, although at the time it felt like it. I was the one driving myself. And yet in his listening, he was like, I don't know why you think you're so good. And that like broke me down. So this was 13 years ago. So right halfway through, it broke me down. And I really did take a hard look at what I was doing. And what I found was that there wasn't a lot of science to it. And then there was a lot less art to it than I thought that I really had. Like I was really full of myself a little bit and a little bit arrogant. I'm as humble now as I've ever been because I'm a perfectionist when it comes to conversations. So when I have a conversation, I'm always thinking about what could be better with it because that's the way I've trained myself.
So let's start to unpack your book a little bit. If we're pretending like we're speaking to someone who is apprehensive to having conversations or maybe stays almost too professional in the conversations to where they don't know the person personally at all. And therefore, some of the things that I was talking about in terms of advancing the relationship becomes more difficult to do because you realize, oh, I actually don't know these folks as well as I thought. So if that's our target audience here in this question, where do they start? Like what process should they follow? What questions should they be asking? How do they get better at this?
The book is 10 chapters. And the first 5 of it, I would consider the art part. And I started with the most important concept, which is rapport. The second 5 is the structure and the conversation model. So where it starts is rapport. And I define rapport as liking and trusting somebody. Because what I found in that model that you talked about, architects and rainmakers and things like that, I'm a guardian. And I have been a guardian for the last 13 years. I'm responsible. I'm like guardian of the galaxy. But I'm guardian of a revenue stream that's close to $8 million in annual revenue. I work with about 130 families who have $650 million in assets with our firm, which I'm very aware is bigger than thousands of financial advisors' practices. So I'm the guardian of that revenue stream. And all I have, and this is true of financial services, all we have are conversations. Now, okay, there's glossy brochures and there's stories of managers, but we're really in a commodity business. So what it comes down to is the rainmakers bringing it in and the guardians holding on to it. And in an annuity stream of business, the guardians are, in my opinion, well, they're both indispensable, but the MVPs are the guardians. So to your question, it starts with rapport. I actually have an acronym here, which often helps. Rules, rapport. Number 2, use questions skillfully. Number 3, listen. And then this is one that's often missing, especially for the extroverts. Exercise self-control. And then S is for satisfy needs. So what I find is that my approach is collaborative, it's consultative, it's needs-based.
Let's try and put this into practice, right? So if you're meeting me for the first time, what are the steps that you're going to take to actually build rapport and ultimately get me to know, like, and trust you? Is it around questions that you're asking? Is it in your tone? Is it in the information that you're sharing? What's involved in building rapport from your perspective?
Getting you talking and matching you.
What do you mean by that?
That's where it starts. So when you meet someone for the first time, you know very little about them. It's like you're getting on the football field and you've never watched any game film. There isn't any game film available to watch. And so what you find is most financial professionals do a lot of talking, like a lot of talking and a lot of talking. And what I want, because where I'm headed is your needs, I want to get you talking. So there's one technique I talk about in chapter 1. I call it the 3 rapport questions, because usually there's a dance, right? The dance is, hi, how are you? Fine. It's a one-word answer. It's almost reflexive. Then I say, what brings you to our firm? Something like that. And they might say, well, I don't really know. But taking a step back and asking a third rapport question, it's like, okay, before we get going, where are you from? Like, who are you? What are your hobbies and interests? So as you've quoted recently on social media, being more interested in them versus being interesting. And what I see over and over again is people talk about the expertise of their firm, the number of years. They get product focused.
So you're bringing up the personalized, questions at the beginning of the conversation, not just going through your planning, your philosophy, your firm structure, all that type of stuff. And I find that advisors a lot of times will do that in the first, 7 to 11 minutes of the conversation. And to your point, and you didn't say this directly, but I get the sense that when advisors do that, and I did that when I had a practice, it's dry and people get anchored on their first impression. If their first impression is dry, it's tough to get them out of that. So what you're saying is, no, let's actually get to know them as a person. And then maybe, a quarter of the way through or halfway through, then you start bringing up the firm structure, process, philosophy, things like that. Because at the end of the day, the industry is, to the consumer anyways, one firm to the next, to the next, to the next, like there isn't a ton of difference in their eyes. And of course, every advisor thinks that they're special and the process is special. So I don't want to diminish that, but in the eyes of the consumer, it's tough for them to evaluate that. So what they're really evaluating at the beginning is, do I like this person? Can I picture meeting with this person 2, 3, 4 times a year for the rest of my life? So you're building the rapport immediately.
Always and everywhere, rapport first.
Okay.
And not just the beginning of the relationship, but in the arena that we step onto 6 to 8 times a day, every conversation. And then throughout the conversation, I'm always monitoring what's the level of rapport. Do they like what's happening? Do they trust what's happening? Would they like me and trust me? Because if they don't like me, they're probably not going to trust me. And if they don't trust me, they're probably not going to like me.
Certainly.
I also want to look into whether they're visual, auditory, or kinesthetic, and I want to match that. So when you ask someone like, what brings you here? And they start talking about the way the world looks to them, then I'm going to use visual language. If they talk really slowly and they're kind of in their core, then I know they're kinesthetic and I better slow down to match them. So matching and mirroring and getting people talking is the way to get started with rapport.
Gotcha. So maybe what we can do for the remainder of this podcast is, it seems like there's a natural break point or stopping point between the art of conversations and then the actual system and process of conversation. So maybe let's just stay on the track that we are right now and focus on the art. So I know, in your book, your second chapter, which is using questions skillfully, what does that mean? So are you like walking in with a list of questions that you go through every single time? Are you basing it on the conversations that's being had? What sorts of questions are you asking? Help unpack that a little bit for us.
Using questions skillfully versus using questions unskillfully or bludgeoning clients with questions. There's a feeling that I have of what I call tic-tac-no. Is that people ask 3 closed-ended questions in a row. Like, did you get our newsletter? No. Did you do this? No. How about this? And it's tic-tac-no, and then boom, the conversation is so deflated. But where it's used successfully and skillfully is simply by having control over whether you're using open-ended questions or closed-ended questions. In our society, there is a pandemic of the use of closed-ended questions. If you start monitoring yourself as well as others, you'll see it's all closed-ended or almost all closed-ended. And what I find when I start a question with closed-ended, I'm going to close things off. So it's not like there isn't a time and place for closed-ended questions. In fact, there are very important junctures in a conversation. But if I'm looking to open up the window instead of closing the window, then I have to be in firm control over whether I use open or closed-ended.
Smirking, and if you're listening to the audio, you can't see me smirk, but I am, because I found a lot of times early on in my career, I asked you say closed-ended questions, I would use the phrase like check the box item questions. And to me, even as we were just talking about this, it just feels transactional, and like people don't want to feel transacted, right? So do you have a certain like go-to open-ended question that you use? Like how do you like prime the pump, so to speak, to get them talking to then ask a follow-up question that's relevant to that? Like how do you even start that process?
What do you think? How do you feel? What's your opinion? Are the three most useful questions to start to get. How do they think? How do they feel? And what's their point of view? I'll make a short statement and then what do you think? So it could be something like, we're bullish right now. What do you think? And if they respond with a think, then back to rapport, then I'm going to gauge my conversation to what they think and what we think. And if I say, and I may even do it as, I don't generally recommend a double question, but I may literally do, we're bullish. What do you think? How do you feel about things? To see where they're at and kind of do that. So then by this time, if I know they're thinkers and I know they're feelers, that's a kind of an odd mix, but okay, I'll go with that. Here's how it feels to us. Or if they're kinesthetic, this is, I want to hold on to that. So going into that spot, but closed-ended are really useful for confirming understanding. Do you follow? Do you know what I mean? So they're very useful there to check for acceptance as you're going through the conversation. But it's as different as opening the window and closing the window. And I want to open the window to start to understand the facts and the feelings and the needs and the wants, because where I'm headed is all about satisfying needs.
So it seems like you're incredibly intentional with the questions that you ask, and then you have basically a repository in your mind as to how to respond or what follow-up question to ask. How did you get to the point to where you're able to just recall that, right, really quick without really having to think of it? Because I'm sure you're not like actively struggling to think about what you're going to say next. It's just probably become intuitive at this point. So what steps did you take and how long did it take to get to that point?
So there's only so many open-ended questions, and they're on page 24 of my book. Mm-hmm. And they're also on my monitor.
Oh, so you
most
have
of my
them
work
up all
is
the
over
time.
I do. And then, one of the first things I do whenever I'm mentoring people or doing a training is I say, would you like me to share my short open-ended probes with you? And it's right here. What do you think? How do you feel? Why? What's your opinion? Those are the first three. What makes you say that? How can that be? Tell me more. And I could go on and on. But basically, there's only about 20 of the open-ended. They're shorter than you might think, because later on in the book, I talk about 9 different types of open-ended questions to be more fine-tuned about it. But the basics, and what's really wonderful about these open-ended questions, the shortest ones, you want them to be less than 7 words, preferably 3 or 4, is they guide a conversation. They're like the paddle for the canoe because they guide it.
Gotcha. Awesome.
Hey, Model FAs. I know you're enjoying this conversation, but I wanted to take a quick break to talk to you about the Model FA Accelerator. This is a unique collaboration between us and you, where we help you build a financial advising practice that you can be proud of. We focus on the foundational concepts around how to pick a niche or a specialization, how to price your services, how to construct an offer that people are going to buy, and then how to market it and sell it in a way that'll get people to sign on the dotted line and become clients of your firm, all while giving you the information to scale and set up workflows and operational processes that will allow you to reclaim your time and build a practice that doesn't run you. So if you'd like to hear more about that, go to www.modelfa.com/accelerator or www.modelfa.com. Hover over, work with us, and click on Accelerator. Hope to see you in the program.
And the next step in your book is all about listening. I found in my career, before I had my talk track down appropriately, before I knew the lingo, or before I, quite frankly, knew the person well enough to actually listen as they were talking, I would just think about what the next question was going to be that I was going to ask them. And therefore, what would happen is they would share this, heartfelt, detailed response. And then I would almost respond something to the effect of like, oh, cool. And then move on to the next totally unrelated question. And just saying that out loud right now, I can certainly imagine what that felt like for them. And I know the way that I feel if someone asks a question that's totally unrelated to what I just poured my heart out on. So how does someone become a better listener in their conversations?
The first way to become a better listener is to stop bad listening habits,
Which are
interrupting. And just like closed-ended questions are kind of a pandemic, and I'm sorry for using the word pandemic, but interrupting is a pandemic. And they've done studies that show men interrupt more than women. People who are higher levels of hierarchy interrupt more because it becomes a paradigm of power. And that's one of the concepts in the book is the different zones of power and listening. But first is stop interrupting. I identify 14 ways to stop yourself from interrupting. One of them is, one of my favorites is just the thinker, as I just put my fist over my, but I mean, you have to do that to create that discipline. Also coming into a conversation from a perspective like, you know what, this client is upset. The market just dropped 50%, and I'm going to tell them how they should feel. Instead, approaching a conversation, listening just to receive their communication. Because until someone unpacks their whole suitcase, the dirty laundry is at the bottom. And if we cut them off right away and then tell them why they shouldn't be worried, you ever notice you're really worried about something and someone tells you you shouldn't be worried about it?
Never works.
It never works. So I want to unpack the suitcase, and I do that with simple open-ended question, maybe a closed-ended, what I call an isolator, which is just anything else. There's more in the book, but those are some of the highlights of the chapter.
Now, when you're in the process of having the actual conversation, right, and you're trying your best to focus on listening, there's kind of like 3 phases as I look back through my career. And I'm not sure if you experienced these as well, which is phase 1, which is what I had just mentioned about as they're talking, right? I'm thinking about what that next question is. And then there's phase 2, which is, okay, I heard them. And now I'm going to think about what that next question is. And then there's the third phase where you just know intuitively what to ask. And I think for me, my go-to question a lot of times when they're done, which gives me more information plus buys me additional time to ask a more specific question, is it's not even a question, it's more of a statement where it's just, tell me more about that. Right. So do you find that there's those phases that people go through in their learning of actually cultivating the skill set of becoming a better listener?
If they become a better listener, they do go through phases. Unfortunately, most people never get there. They think they're better listeners, but just what I've seen, they're so entrenched in their bad habits. Active listening is such an important skill here. I come from parents who are in the mental health field, and so I just picked up active listening as a very important thing, but that also is a key way to listen better, is to be active about it. So echoing and paraphrasing are just amazing tools.
And I think too, when people can't perfect this on their own, it's because they potentially are a little limited in their thinking, in that they're only practicing this skill in their profession. But why not with your spouse, right? Why not with your friends? Why not at the grocery store, right? Like, conversations are not just a professional activity. Conversations are your everyday activity, right? So there's a reason why if someone's learning a new language, it's easier to learn that language if everyone at your home is also speaking that language, right? So this language, quote unquote, of conversations needs to not be limited in just your professional setting, but in every other area of your life as well. And in my previous life, having been married and now not married, I can tell you that I was not a very good listener personally and professionally at that stage in my life. And if I had worked on that a little bit better, personally and professionally, things may have worked out differently. Who knows? But it's interesting to see what I struggled with professionally was something that I also struggled with personally as well.
In addition to focusing on rapport and having the short open-ended questions at your ready to guide a conversation and get the client to open up, I do also a lot of planning for a conversation in advance. And I do think of instead of just thinking about the topics I want to cover as a financial professional, I think about the questions that I'm going to ask, the areas that they need to think about in their world in order to get where they need to go financially speaking.
Cool. And we're going to get to the planning portion in part 2, but I appreciate you alluding in that direction. I think if the more you know about someone up front, and I think I talked about this when I was on your show, which is social media leaves a lot of clues as to what folks are interested in and what they're passionate about. So you have some topics that you can naturally bring up to get them excited, get them talking. So let's assume we're at the point now in the conversation, Ivan, where you've built some rapport, you've gotten a sense as to their feelings about the industry and what they're looking to accomplish. We've gotten a sense as to what some of their passions and their hobbies are. And then we need to transition from, okay, I kind of like you too, but like, what can you actually help me with, right? And the advisor's thinking, well, what do you need help with? So how do you go about identifying the needs of the person so that you can in turn come up with a compelling solution that causes them to take action?
I'm pretty direct about this part. I simply ask people, what do you need? What do you need this money to do? What do you need to accomplish for your family? My relationships now with my clients are really, there's a lot of longevity. The average relationship I have is 12 years. So I still, though, start every conversation with an agenda, and we'll come back to setting an agenda and preparing and planning in the second half. But I always start with, is there anything you need me to address? Or what do you need from us that you're not currently getting? So I always start with needs and end with needs, because at the end of the model is I'm going to resolve and make sure I satisfy their needs. Find a way to do it. Because if I'm not satisfying their needs, and for the listeners out there, if they're not satisfying their clients' needs, someone else will.
So it seems like what you ultimately end up doing is you start off with more open-ended questions that just have to do, or stay within the scope of what you do professionally, right? After you build some rapport, which is around financial planning. And my guess is once you have them articulate those things, you're going to present your solutions to those needs, but use their exact words that they used as opposed to your corporate jargon that maybe came through initial training at some point along your career, where it's like, here's our, model or whatever the process is. It's more so making sure that you're just doing a good job regurgitating what they already told you in relation, to the solutions that you had identified.
Right. I'm not a very good basketball shooter, but I would much rather have my client put up the backboard, put up the rim, put a little net hanging down from it so that I know what I'm looking at. And so I want my client or prospect to tell me where the backboard is. Otherwise, I'm just shooting baskets in the dark with my eyes closed.
Now, what if you come across a situation, though, where someone comes in and you ask questions like that, but maybe they're not conversational, right? And maybe they say, I don't know, John just said that you're a good person and that we should meet. And so here I am. And they're not really giving you much. So how can you salvage that conversation? Or when do you close the door if you get a sense that it's not actually going anywhere? Because I feel like that can happen quite a bit.
Yes, there's a type of people that you need to get to open up by being persistent in your question asking. There's a probe we can talk about, and it's later in the book, called a greaser. It's a way to just grease that skid so that the person who's tight-lipped, but like if someone says, I'm good, you're good, I heard you're good, you have to have that, and this is where we are, the exercise in self-control. You have to exercise the pause. It's the most important note in music. My teacher in 8th grade theory taught me is the rest. So if someone says, you're good, I'm going to wait, and then I'm going to use my active listening, like one word. I might say, good. And if you wait long enough, they will say more. So because I've had to deal with a lot of tight-lipped, I have a lot of families that are warm. I'm like part of the family because it's been 12 years. I know more about them than anyone else in the world. And we can go into that too as a strategy. But I'm in my clients' lives, and probably more than anyone else. That's how you are the guardian, is by peeling back the pomegranate, and there's a lot of seeds in there. But with regard to exercise and self-control, there's a strategy to get anyone to open up.
I really like the just perfect mirroring, oh yeah, you're good and good. They're going to crack every time. I think that where advisors struggle, I know where I struggled early on in my career, is being uncomfortable with that silence. And this kind of leads over to self-control to a certain extent, where you got to have the self-control to just be silent and give them the opportunity to talk and be okay, with that potentially awkward silence. So I guess going into self-control, to wrap up this portion of the episode, and then we'll go through more of the systems and the process in part 2. But when you say exercise self-control, what do you mean by that?
Everything that comes out of your mouth is intentional. It was done for a purpose. Every part of the conversation is planful, and you know exactly where you're going. You have 3 perspectives at all times. You have an observation about what you're doing, what they're doing, and then you evaluate the conversation as if you are an independent observer. So having those 3 perspectives gives you control. Having a remote control for the conversation, metaphorically speaking, is also important. Like if it's not going well, hit pause. I will often say like, wait, let's take a pause here, or let's rewind. So having that control to say, this conversation isn't going where I need it to go. Let's rewind a bit. Or if the conversation is kind of droning on, you're covering the same topic again and again, let's fast forward a bit. Because I think we've covered this before, and there's some solutions that I could propose right now before we even finish. We can always rewind and go back. But so there's a lot of different ways to control yourself. And ultimately, what we all want is to be able to control and guide a conversation. And if we don't control ourselves first, then there's no hope.
What are some examples of advisors not controlling themselves? So we have something that advisors who are listening to this episode can say, oh yeah, that's me, right? How do we identify those?
They're talking between 80 and 90% of the time. Mm-hmm. There's no control in that. So the self-control is actually what you need. It's kind of a bedrock for making sure you establish rapport, use questions skillfully, and listen. Like if you just stop right there, rapport, use questions skillfully, and listen, then you'd be ahead of 90% of financial advisors. But that takes control to stop yourself from talking.
Is there a way to practice that, Ivan, when you're not live with a client or a prospect?
Yes. Role play, mentoring, practicing with colleagues. Role play, Mike and I talk about this all the time. Role play is the most vastly underutilized tool for improving in conversations.
When I was at Northwestern, that was one of the most uncomfortable things that I had ever done, especially as a 20-year-old at that time, which is, phoning and fact finding and closing and, writing out your language, role playing it with, someone looking there, videotaping you so that you could go back and re-listen to it. But it was by far probably the most impactful thing that I could have done in my career. But it's uncomfortable. So very rarely do people actually go through that process to refine their skill in a very intentional way, which means that if you go through that process and refine that skill, you're going to be ahead of most advisors out there, because most advisors aren't doing that. They're not utilizing that process.
I have a method with role play that makes it much more useful than, I think mostly the way it's done is people stay in character the whole time. And it's really like fake and uncomfortable. But what I'll often do is we'll stop at a certain juncture and I say, okay, you just said this, rewind just a little bit. You have 3 ways you could take it. Tell me the benefit of taking it A versus B versus C. And then they're like, I like A. And I already know where that's going to go. And I said, well, let's play that through. And you play that through and you're like, oh, that is not going to work. So they said, well, let's try B, let's try C. So you kind of step in and out of character, which makes it much more useful. Plus, if you do it with someone who's more experienced than you get a lot of benefit from that you don't get from simply doing it with another rookie. Like that's often a problem. It's a rookie role playing with a rookie.
Yeah. And a lot of times, because I ran our new advisor development program, so we would have them role play initially before they role played with me. And I would ask them, hey, what's your feedback on, John? And they always had like nice things to say. And then John would go through his language and I'd be able to provide so much constructive criticism because I feel like they're too inexperienced and quite frankly, too nice at that stage to actually give some helpful criticism. So I do think a mentor in that sense who has more experience can be extremely beneficial for sure. So far today, we've talked about building rapport, using questions skillfully, doing a great job listening, focusing on the needs, and ultimately exercising self-control through the entire process so that you can control the entire process. In our next episode with Ivan, we're going to be talking about how to prepare and plan in advance, how to create through opening statements and making sure that you're checking for acceptance along the way. Maybe getting some buy-ins as you're having the conversation, exploring different ways in which you can further build rapport and identify additional needs, making sure that we're addressing and we're resolving and gaining agreements for action. So the next episode will be much more systematic and a very thoughtful plan, whereas I feel like today was not even a 30,000 foot view, maybe like a 10,000 foot view. I think a lot of my methodology that I go through, that I went through on your show, is more 30,000 foot view of building relationships in general. So what I like about this is we're refining a little bit more, and in the next episode we're going to refine even more to where people actually have a plan to implement this. So to close out, Ivan, I have 3 questions for you. Number 1 is, where can they buy your book? And I ask because although I have one, it was a gift from Michael, who I gave a shout out to before. So I actually didn't buy it. So where can they buy your book? Number 2, where can they find you if they have questions or they want to connect with you? And then number 3, you're working on a little project right now that helps people like me who don't necessarily enjoy sitting down and reading. So I'd like you to put that out into the universe to further hold you accountable to following through.
Number 1, Amazon.com is the best place to buy the book. There's a lot of books with conversations in the title, so it helps to just type in Conversations Ivan Farber. But you could also just Google Conversations Ivan Farber and it'll take you right to the Amazon book. # conversations about conversations, and also conversations.biz. I love the .biz because I'm all about the biz.
Love
but
it.
Conversation.biz is my website. And there's a link to the book as well as to all the different places that you can check out my podcast: Spotify, Google, Apple, iHeartRadio, and Amazon also is the podcast. And then the third thing is I'm now 3 hours into recording the book. I've made it through chapter 3 as an audiobook. I'm learning a lot. I'm going to have to re-record all the way through chapter 2, but I've never done this before. And absolutely, you as a coach, as a friend, as someone who's inspired me to do this, like, it's in my head, I'm working on it, and I am committed to creating an audiobook, and I'm going to need some beta listeners. And I thought of you as my beta listener. So I'm requesting you be the beta listener.
Appreciate that. By the way, I will say for those of you who are listening is, if you do prefer to listen to books, certainly get the audiobook when it comes out, probably at some point in first quarter next year, right around that time frame. But I would also suggest that you pick up a hard copy, because there are lists of questions. There are things that you're just going to want to flip to real quick and utilize the actual tangible version. So you may not actually read this book, but if you're listening to it, but you will want to reference this book, because there are portions of it that are more of like a manual sort of repository of questions that are just easy to flick back and forth to, as opposed to trying to go and finding it or taking notes while you're scribbling. So Ivan, I very much appreciate you joining today. For all of you who are listening, thanks for tuning in. Feel free and make sure to write us a review, give us some feedback, like us on Facebook at Model FA, Instagram at Model FA, LinkedIn at Model FA. And if we can be of service in any way, shape, or form with your business, be it helping refine your practice management, helping with your marketing strategy, helping refine your niche, coaching and accountability, feel free to reach out to us as well. My direct email is david@modelfa.com. And the platform that I'm most active and engaged on is Instagram. And you can find me at David_DeCelle. So Ivan, grateful that Michael brought us together. Grateful that you brought me on your show, and grateful that this is just part 1 of a 2-part series. So we get to hang out some more.
I'm grateful as well. I appreciate the conversation and the relationship that we have been building. There's a lot of potential and possibility. So thank you for having me.
Awesome. Take care.